So next point, point 8, is quite interesting. I've called it the big Harvard bribe of 1965. And this came to the fore only a few years ago. And here was a report of this paper. So sugar papers reveal industry's role in shifting national heart disease focus to saturated fat. And the paper that is referred to is by Kearns, Schmidt, and Glantz. And the title is Sugar Industry and Coronary Heart Disease Research, a Historical Analysis of Internal Industry Documents. And the story is that on the 1st of July, 1965, the vice president of the Sugar Research Foundation in the United States paid a courtesy call to the Harvard Medical School, particularly the nutrition division, where he met with one or two of the professors there, and in his baggage that he carried with him were 4 articles that had just been published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in the June 1965 issue of the Annals of Internal Medicine. And his concern was that these 4 articles seemed to suggest that carbohydrates and sugar were detrimental to cardiovascular health. So remember, this is 1965. Keyes's hypothesis has been around since 1953. But there's plenty of interest in the role of carbohydrates causing hypertriglyceridemia, which may also be related to coronary artery disease. So the first of these 4 papers was by Ostrander and colleagues, and they reported that an elevated blood glucose concentration, even in the absence of diabetes, was at least as good a predictor of future CHD risk as was the blood cholesterol concentration. The second paper was by Frederick Epstein, who interestingly was one of Keyes' premier acolytes and who became one of his greatest supporters. But clearly in 1965 he wasn't quite so convinced. And he was involved in the very famous Tecumseh study, which is an epidemiological study of an entire population. And they also showed in the Tecumseh study that there was no relationship between the diet and blood cholesterol concentrations in that population. And that's one of about 20 or 30 studies showing exactly the same thing. But what they did find was that the presence of type 2 diabetes predicted more severe disease in all the arteries throughout the body, not just in the coronary arteries. Thus, the detection of hyperglycemia with significant frequency among persons with each of 5 different manifestations of atherosclerotic vascular disease is a unique finding amongst epidemiological studies. So they were taking the relationship of diabetes beyond just the coronary arteries. Then the third paper was by Peter Q and David Bassett. And Q had been one of the finders of this carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia, and now he looked at the role of sugar in producing hypertriglyceridemia, not just carbohydrates. So he'd already linked carbohydrates to hypertriglyceridemia. Now he looked at sugar. And he found that the data indicate that sugar is a potent lipemic agent as compared with starches. And a high dietary sugar intake may well be the most important factor in the production of the clinically encountered type of hyperglyceridemia. And here's his graph or his data showing that in a group of people, when they ate their self-selected diet or they ate the sugar diet with carbohydrate as sugar, their triglycerides, phospholipids, and cholesterol all increased. However, once they replaced the carbohydrate from sugar as starch, all of the values fell again. But when they reintroduced sugar, all the values rose again. And it repeated as they removed the sugar and replaced it with starch, down went the values again. So that was fairly good evidence that sugar was causing hypertriglyceridemia, whereas starch seemed to be protective. That's a really interesting point that perhaps we haven't mentioned as much, that starch has a quite different effect than sugar on blood triglyceride concentrations. And the final article was an editorial by Margaret Olbrink, who was one of the first persons to say that triglycerides are an important cause of coronary heart disease. And she said that she then looked at the biological evidence that humans had humans had evolved eating a high-fat diets. And she said the data are consistent with the hypothesis that the common modern diseases of diabetes, atherosclerosis, and obesity and associated hypertriglyceridemia may be the present-day manifestations of the effect of affluence on a once useful genetic trait, the ability to conserve carbohydrate. And the trait that she's talking about, if you look at it carefully, was insulin resistance. So what she's saying is that insulin resistance is the underlying cause for modern diseases, diabetes, atherosclerosis, and obesity and hypertriglyceridemia, and that they are manifest in people who are insulin resistant and who are eating high carbohydrate diets. So this is another interesting paper that came out in the same time, and to which the Harvard professors, who were being encouraged to write some articles, which we'll come to, they also knew about this paper, which was then available, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1966, which was a study of the relationship of fat, simple sugars, and complex sugars, and as a percentage of the calories and blood cholesterol concentrations in 16 different countries. And they showed that whereas fat caused an increase in blood cholesterol concentrations, simple sugars had a much bigger effect, whereas complex sugars caused a reduction. And this study also was causing the Harvard guys a bit of trouble as they started writing their review. So the point of showing you that is to show exactly what was going on behind the scenes. 9 months into the project, in April 1966, Hegsted, who was one of the professors at Harvard, told the Sugar Research Foundation that the review had been delayed because of new evidence linking sugar to coronary heart disease. Every time the Iowa group published a paper, we had to rework a section in rebuttal. The Iowa group was this group who reported a positive association between sugar consumption and elevated serum cholesterol levels in this epidemiological associational type study. So what this shows was that Hegsted from Harvard was biased, significantly biased, because he was writing in April 1966 he was trying to downplay the sugar link to blood cholesterol concentrations and heart disease. And he was doing that because he'd been given money by the Sugar Research Foundation to write an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine. And one of the other people who was involved was Fred Stair, who was also one of the professors at Harvard. And he was known to be an easy catch for industry. As someone wrote an article about him, Harvard sugar-pushing nutritionist, that is Fred Stair. In all these disputes, Dr. Stair had played a Panglossian role by maintaining that DDT is harmless, sugar is good for you, and saccharin is pure pleasure and won't hurt you. And I had to look up what a definition of Panglossian is. It's someone who's marked by the view that all is the best in this best of possible worlds, someone who's excessively optimistic. So Dr. Stair was not someone who was particularly critical. He was only too happy to promote any idea that was optimistic. So Fred Stair combined with Robert McGandy and Donald Hegsted from Harvard to write this review in the New England Journal of Medicine, Dietary Fat, Carbohydrates, and Atherosclerotic Vascular Disease, with a concluding second part. And this is what they concluded in 1967. And this was a pivotal study because in my impression or interpretation, this was the end of the debate that carbohydrates might be causing heart disease. From this moment on, carbohydrates and sugar as potential risk factors for coronary heart disease are written out of history, and it all becomes the diet heart hypothesis and the lipid hypothesis of Ansel Keys. So the major evidence today, and that's 1967, suggests that one avenue by which diet may affect the development and progression of atherosclerosis. Sorry, there's only one avenue. This is by influencing the level of serum lipids, especially serum cholesterol, though this may take place by means of different biochemical mechanisms not yet understood. So there we go. It's only cholesterol. If you read that today, you would say, well, that's what we've been taught now for the last 50 odd years. Well, that's where it starts. There can be no doubt, and when I read that, I always say, well, therefore there's clear doubt, because if there was no doubt, you wouldn't have to say it. So there can be no doubt. In other words, there's plenty of doubt that levels of cholesterol can be substantially modified by manipulation of the fat and cholesterol of the diet. And that is true in laboratory studies, but in the general population, the other factors that influence the serum cholesterol are much greater. They have much greater effect than diet. But this is something that is hidden, and I've given all the evidence to show that. We conclude on the basis of epidemiologic, experimental, and clinical evidence that a lowering of the proportion of dietary saturated fatty acids, increasing the proportion of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and reducing the level of dietary cholesterol are the dietary changes most likely to be a benefit. The solution here, in our opinion, is a responsibility and opportunity for the food industry, namely the manufacture of many common foods with characteristics that will lessen the development of atherosclerosis. This is possible today and only awaits leadership from the food industry. And that's quite a statement, that the food industry must lead us in developing foods that are healthy for us. Well, of course they did, and they replaced fats with sugar and refined carbohydrates and caused the obesity and diabetes epidemic. So this statement is quite important in the context of what happened subsequently. Now, he had to write out sugar and carbohydrates, these guys, so that this is what they said. Limited evidence from studies on man as well as from researchers on laboratory animals show a slightly significant role for the kind and amount of dietary carbohydrates in the regulation of serum lipids. And that's nonsense, because it's very clear that serum triglycerides are influenced most actively by the carbohydrate content of the diet. These effects are somewhat more pronounced when diets low in fat are consumed. Since diets low in fat and high in sugar are rarely taken, we conclude that the practical significance of differences in dietary carbohydrate is minimal in comparison to those related to dietary fat and cholesterol. Well, sadly, the diet that would be promoted after 1977 was low in fat and high in sugar, because once the fat was taken out of the diet, the taste went away, and the taste had to be replaced with sugar. So this is an important statement, because we now understand how incorrect it was.